When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the war did not end. It simply went underground. The spoils of this new silent war were not gold or art or territory. The ultimate prize was knowledge. Specifically, it was the knowledge held inside the skulls of the enemy, the men who had built the world's most terrifying weapons. And as the Third Reich crumbled into dust and ash, a frantic, invisible race began between two allies who were about to become mortal enemies, the United States and the Soviet Union. The starting pistol for the Cold War had been fired, and the first battle was a scavenger hunt for Nazi scientists. This is the story of how the United States made a deal with the devil to win the future. This is the story of Operation Paperclip. Part 1. The Devil's Workshop. April 1945, Nordhausen, Germany. Colonel Holger Toftoy of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps felt the cold, damp air hit him long before he saw the entrance. It smelled of sulfur, burnt oil, and something else, something rotten. His boots echoed in the vast man-made cavern. This was not a factory. It was a tomb. They called it Mittelwerk, the Central Works. Toftoy was a rocket man. For years, he and his colleagues at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland had been struggling to match the technological terror that had rained down on London, Antwerp, and Paris. The German V2, or Vergeltungswaffen II, Retribution Weapon II, was a marvel. It was a 46-foot-tall, 14-ton ballistic missile that broke the sound barrier and touched the edge of space before delivering a ton of explosives. It was not a weapon. It was science fiction, made real. And Toftoy was here to steal it. But the intelligence reports had not prepared him for this. The factory was a massive tunnel complex bored straight through the Harz Mountains. It was immune to Allied bombing. Inside, Toftoy and his men found a scene from Dante's Inferno. This was the kingdom of SS General Hans Kammler, a man who built his weapons with human slaves. Thousands of men, Russians, Poles, French, and Jews from the nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp were forced to work here. They lived and died in the tunnels. The U.S. soldiers found piles of bodies, stacked like firewood. They found emaciated survivors, their eyes hollow. The average life expectancy of a worker in the Mittelwerk was 6 to 8 weeks. More people died building the V2 than were killed by it. "My God," whispered Toftoy's aide. Toftoy himself was rigid. He was a soldier, but he was also an engineer. He looked past the horror, his eyes tracing the assembly lines. He saw half-finished rockets, giant engine components, and, most importantly, blueprints. Technical schematics were scattered everywhere. This was the Devil's Workshop, and its architects were nowhere to be found. As Toftoy secured the factory, he knew a terrible truth. The physical rockets were valuable, but the men who understood them, the men who knew the equations, the formulas for the exotic fuel, the guidance systems, were the real prize. Hundreds of miles away, in the Bavarian Alps, a different kind of calculation was being made. Dr. Wernher von Braun, the aristocratic, charismatic, and dangerously ambitious wunderkind of German rocketry, looked at the collapsing map of Germany. He was not a fanatic Nazi in the ideological sense. His only religion was the rocket. His goal was not to win the war. He knew that was lost. His goal was to get to the moon.
The SS, under Himmler, had orders to execute him and his top scientists rather than let them be captured. The Soviets were closing in from the east. He knew what would happen to him in Soviet hands. He gathered his top 500 scientists. "The war is lost," he told them flatly. "The question now is to whom do we surrender?" It was a business decision. The British had no money. The French were irrelevant. The Soviets were butchers. That left the Americans. They had the money, the resources, and, he wagered, the pragmatism to overlook his past in exchange for his future. He made his move. He ordered his brother Magnus to ride a bicycle down a mountain pass to find the nearest American patrol. "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." Back in Washington, D.C., the pieces of the puzzle were landing on desks at the Pentagon. They had the factory, Mittelwerk. They had the hardware. Toftoy's men were already crating 100 V2 rockets to ship to New Mexico. And now they had the golden goose, Wernher von Braun and his team. But there was a problem, a very big one. President Harry T. Truman had just signed an order, Standard Policy Number 1067. It was explicit. No ardent Nazis, no SS members, and no one implicated in war crimes was to be employed by the United States. Period. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, read the files on von Braun's team. They weren't just rocket scientists. Von Braun himself was an SS major. His colleague, Arthur Rudolph, who ran the Mittelwerk factory, was a Nazi loyalist who had personally overseen the slave labor. Another, Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later called the father of space medicine, had overseen horrific experiments on prisoners at Dachau, freezing them to death to study hypothermia. They were war criminals. They were brilliant. They were, according to Truman's own directive, inadmissible. But the Soviets had just captured the other half of the German rocket program. The race was on. An intelligence officer in the Pentagon, whose name is lost to history, took the file of the first scientist. It detailed his SS rank and his Nazi Party affiliations. He took a simple plain paper clip and attached a new, blank summary page to the front of the file. On this new page, he wrote, "No derogatory information." He had just laundered a Nazi. The project needed a name. They called it Operation Overcast. Soon, as the laundry pile of files grew, it would be given the name that stuck, named after the simple office tool used to hide a mountain of sins. Operation Paperclip was born. The first 127 German scientists, including Wernher von Braun, were packed onto a ship, their pasts erased, their futures aimed at the stars. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were War Department special employees. They set sail to a new life in a country that had just finished a bloody war against them, arriving in secret at Fort Strong, Boston, in September 1945. They had no idea where they were going next. They just knew they had made the right choice. The Americans, however, were just beginning to understand the price of their new pact. Part 2. The Gilded Cage. El Paso, Texas, late 1945. The train journey from Boston had been a disorienting blur of abundance. After the starvation rations and bombed-out ruins of Germany, America was a surreal landscape of endless food, brightly lit cities, and undamaged infrastructure. Wernher von Braun and his team, the 127 special employees, were ghosts traveling through a land that had no concept of the world they had just left. Their destination was Fort Bliss, a sprawling, sun-baked army base on the border of Texas and New Mexico. This was the edge of nowhere. Their new home was a series of hastily converted Spartan barracks surrounded by barbed wire. The Americans called it the P.O. Box 1142 project. The Germans had a different name for it, the Insel, the island. They were in a gilded cage. They were not prisoners of war. Their army handlers were polite, even deferential. They ate in the officers' mess, but they could not leave. Their mail was heavily censored, and they were forbidden from speaking to any locals. Their families, wives, and children were still in Germany, held in a U.S. Army-controlled camp named Landshut, a fact that was left unsaid but understood by all. They were collateral. Colonel Holger Toftoy, the man who had first entered the hell of Mittelwerk, was now their commander. His task was monumental: to build an American missile program from absolute zero. "Gentlemen," Toftoy addressed the Germans in their first briefing, "you are here to show us how you did it. You will reassemble the V-2s you brought from Germany, and you will teach my men how to fire them." The V-2s were 100 rockets worth of components, salvaged from the Mittelwerk tunnels and shipped across the Atlantic in 341 freight cars. They were now rusting in the desert sun at the newly established White Sands Proving Ground, a 3,200 square mile patch of barren wasteland in New Mexico. The task began. For the American engineers and soldiers assigned to the project, it was a deeply unsettling experience. These Germans, with their precise calculations and air of intellectual superiority, had been the enemy just months ago. Newsreels in the base movie theater were still showing the liberation of the concentration camps. Now they were colleagues. The culture clash was immediate. The Americans, practical and hands-on, were accustomed to trial and error. The Germans, led by von Braun, were theoreticians. They insisted on meticulous mathematical modeling before a single screw was turned. "You Americans," one German scientist famously remarked, "have the parts, the money, and the will, but you do not know the why." Von Braun was the center of this strange universe. He was charming, fluent in English, and relentlessly optimistic. He spoke not of weapons, but of spaceships. He would sit with the young American engineers, sketching elegant multi-stage rockets on napkins, explaining how they would one day reach the moon. He captivated them. He masterfully navigated his new reality. He presented himself as a pure scientist, forced by circumstance to work for the Nazis. "Science has no moral side," he often said. "It is a tool. How that tool is used is the business of the politician, the soldier." He never spoke of Mittelwerk. He never mentioned his SS uniform. Meanwhile, the laundering of his team's files continued back in Washington. The JIOA agents were becoming masters of bureaucratic deception. Men like Arthur Rudolph, the slave-driving factory manager of Mittelwerk, had their files paperclipped. His summary now read, "Not an ardent Nazi, nothing in his record to prevent his immigration to the U.S." But as the rockets were being pieced together, the truth of their origin was impossible to ignore. One day, a V-2 engine component was uncrated. Inside, caked in dried fluid and grime, a U.S. private found a human finger. The work paused briefly. The horror was acknowledged, silently. And then the work continued. The pressure from Washington was immense. The Soviets were making progress. Captured German technicians in Russia were also being put to work. The Cold War was solidifying, and the V-2 was the blueprint for the next generation of warfare, the intercontinental ballistic missile. On April 16, 1946, at White Sands, the first V-2 rocket assembled on American soil stood ready on the launch pad. Von Braun, Toftoy, and the joint German and American team huddled in the concrete blockhouse. The air was thick with tension. This was the test. Was the knowledge transferable? The countdown reached 0. The 14-ton missile roared to life, shuddering with a sound that ripped the desert air. It climbed, streaking into the bright blue sky on a perfect, terrifying column of fire and smoke. It reached an altitude of 3.4 miles before its gyroscope failed, and it came tumbling back down to Earth, exploding in a massive fireball. In the blockhouse, there was silence. Then Wernher von Braun turned to a dejected American general and smiled. "It failed, yes, but it flew," von Braun said, his eyes alight. It was a failure, but it was a spectacular failure. It was the first time a ballistic missile had left the ground in the Western Hemisphere. The Americans were ecstatic. They hadn't just launched a rocket, they had launched a program. The success cemented the value of the paperclip scientists. Their status began to change. Their families were approved for travel. The barbed wire around their barracks started to seem less like a prison and more like a protective barrier. They were no longer just special employees. They were becoming indispensable. Across the country, however, public sentiment was hardening. The Nuremberg trials were revealing the full, systemic evil of the Nazi regime. A popular new phrase was entering the American vocabulary, the Red Scare. Suspicion of foreigners, of secrets, and of government overreach was growing. And in the New Mexico desert, the U.S. government was secretly harboring, protecting, and promoting the very men who had built the Third Reich's most advanced weapons. The secret of Operation Paperclip was holding, but the moral contradictions were beginning to cast a long shadow. The race to the stars had begun, funded by a deal with the devil, and the first payment was now due. Part 3. Rocket City, USA. 1947 to 1950, Washington, D.C., and Huntsville, Alabama. The secret could not hold forever. The temporary arrangement at Fort Bliss was becoming a logistical and political nightmare. The scientists were languishing, confined to reassembling old V-2s when they were capable of so much more. The Army needed a permanent home for its new missile program, far from the prying eyes of the press and safe from Soviet espionage. They found it in Huntsville, Alabama. It was a sleepy southern cotton town of 16,000 people, chosen precisely because it was insignificant. The Army owned a 40,000-acre complex nearby, the Redstone Arsenal. In 1950, the entire paperclip operation, scientists, families, and hardware, was transferred en masse. For the Germans, it was liberation. Their families, having been brought over from Germany, were now with them. The barbed wire fences were gone. They were moved into the suburbs of Huntsville, which rapidly became known as Rocket City. The transformation was surreal. This deeply American, segregated southern town was suddenly populated by 130 German families. They enrolled their children in local schools. Their wives joined gardening clubs and church groups. Wernher von Braun, with his boundless charisma, became a local celebrity, joining the Chamber of Commerce and advocating for a local symphony orchestra. This placid domesticity masked a reality of breathtaking consequence. By day, these men, who just 5 years prior were building weapons of terror for Adolf Hitler, were now the backbone of America's national defense. At Redstone Arsenal, von Braun was given a new title, Director of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA. His mission was no longer to tinker, it was to build an arsenal. The driving force was fear. In 1949, the world shuddered. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, years ahead of American estimates. U.S. intelligence confirmed the Soviets were aggressively developing long-range missiles, using their own contingent of captured German scientists. The race was no longer theoretical. Von Braun's team, now working with a new generation of brilliant young American engineers, began work on a new missile, the PGM-11 Redstone. It was a direct descendant of the V-2, but bigger, more powerful, and designed to carry a nuclear warhead. This work required the scientists' pasts to be permanently erased. The JIOA's paperclipping was no longer enough. The scientists needed high-level security clearances. To get those, they needed to be American citizens. One by one, the men of Paperclip were brought before the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Men like Arthur Rudolph, the slave driver of Mittelwerk, stood, raised their right hands, and swore an oath of allegiance to the United States. The past, officially, was buried. But it refused to stay dead. In Washington, a few dissenting voices began to ask questions. Columnist Drew Pearson, a muckraking journalist with sources everywhere, got a tip. He published a scathing column in 1947 titled "Our Guest Scientists," exposing the Nazi affiliations of the men at Fort Bliss. He called it a shocking, amoral, and dangerous operation. The outcry was immediate, but short-lived. The Pentagon and the White House shut it down. The story was dismissed as unpatriotic fear-mongering. The public, increasingly terrified of Stalin, was more concerned with the future threat of communism than the past crimes of fascism. The scientists were defended as critical assets. Among the scientists themselves, the past was a ghost at the banquet. They were living the American dream. They had large suburban homes, new cars, and professional respect. But they were haunted. One evening, a group of the scientists were at a barbecue in von Braun's backyard. They were grilling steaks and drinking American beer. One of the men, Dr. Georg Ricke, who had been the general director of Mittelwerk, was arrested. U.S. Army investigators had uncovered his role in the hangings of prisoners at the Dora camp. He was flown back to Germany to stand trial for war crimes. The rest of the Paperclip team was stunned. It was a terrifying reminder that their new lives were built on a fragile foundation. Ricke was ultimately acquitted in the German court, a controversial verdict based on conflicting testimony. The U.S. Army quietly brought him back to America and gave him a new job. The message was clear. If you were valuable enough, even a war crimes trial was just a bureaucratic hurdle. Von Braun learned the lesson well. He doubled down on his public relations. He began writing articles for popular magazines like Collier's, illustrated with beautiful, sweeping paintings of elegant space stations and ships landing on the moon. He appeared on television, most notably on a popular Disney program, Man in Space. He was no longer Wernher von Braun, the SS Major. He was Wernher von Braun, the father of the American space program, a visionary, a dreamer, a clean-cut, all-American hero who spoke of mankind's destiny in the stars. And as he was charming the nation, his team at Huntsville was perfecting the Redstone. It was the missile that would soon put America's first satellite and its first man into space. But first, America would have to be humiliated. The future was about to arrive not from Alabama, but from the barren steppes of Kazakhstan. The world was about to hear a new sound, a simple, terrifying beep, beep, beep from the sky. Part 4. The Beep Heard Round the World. October 4th, 1957, Huntsville, Alabama. Wernher von Braun was at a formal dinner at the Redstone Arsenal Officers Club, hosting the incoming Secretary of Defense, Neo Makarong. He was in his element, charming, articulate, and lobbying for his space program. An aide discreetly pulled him aside. "Dr. von Braun," he whispered, his face pale, "you need to come now." They rushed to his office. A small ham radio receiver had been set up. A tinny, hypnotic, and utterly alien sound filled the room. Beep, beep, beep. It was coming from orbit, 1,400 miles above their heads. It was Sputnik 1, a 184-pound polished metal sphere launched by the Soviet Union. Von Braun listened, his expression unreadable. For years he had been telling anyone who would listen, the Army, Congress, the President, that this was the future. He and his team had a rocket, the Jupiter C, an advanced Redstone, sitting in a warehouse, capable of launching a satellite. They had begged for permission. But the Eisenhower administration had reservations. They were deeply uncomfortable with the optics. They did not want America's grand entry into the space age to be delivered by a German team using a German missile derived from the V-2. They had given the prestigious task to the U.S. Navy's Vanguard program. Now the Soviets had beaten them. The beep, beep, beep was not just a scientific achievement, it was a global propaganda victory, a terrifying testament to Soviet missile superiority. The American public, which had been basking in the glow of post-war prosperity and technological dominance, was thrown into a state of profound shock and collective hysteria. This was not just a satellite, it was a red moon. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could certainly put a nuclear warhead on an ICBM and drop it on Washington, New York, or Huntsville. The missile gap was born. Schools scrambled to beef up their science and math curricula. Americans stared nervously at the night sky, trying to catch a glimpse of the tiny, fast-moving star that proved they were vulnerable. The pressure on the White House was unbearable. In a panic, they rushed the Navy's Vanguard rocket to the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. On December 6, 1957, in front of the entire world's press, the Vanguard rocket ignited. It rose 4 feet off the pad, shuddered, and then collapsed in on itself, exploding in a catastrophic fireball. The newspapers were merciless. Flopnik, Kaputnik, Stay Putnik. The humiliation was total. The nation's pride was shattered. That same night, the phone rang in Wernher von Braun's home. It was the White House. The message was simple: get to work. Wernher von Braun had been waiting for this call for 2 years. He said, "We can be ready in 90 days. He privately told his team they would do it in 84. What followed was one of the most frantic and intense efforts in American engineering history. The ABMA team at Huntsville, along with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, worked 24/7. The rivalries, the bureaucratic red tape, the political hesitation, it all vanished. On the freezing cold night of January 31st, 1958, their rocket, the Jupiter C, stood on the launch pad. It was topped with a small 31-pound satellite named Explorer 1. In the blockhouse, the tension was suffocating. This was not just a launch, it was for the entire soul of the country. The countdown hit 0. The rocket thundered to life, a perfect, brilliant white flame that lit up the Florida night. It climbed, straight and true, disappearing into the blackness. For 15 agonizing minutes, the blockhouse waited for the signal. Had it reached orbit? Then, from a tracking station in California, the confirmation came. Explorer 1 was in orbit. It was transmitting. The blockhouse erupted. Grown men wept. Wernher von Braun, Arthur Rudolph and the other German scientists, the pariahs of 1945, were lifted on the shoulders of their American colleagues. They were national heroes. In the press conference that followed, a beaming Wernher von Braun stood side by side with the American scientists, a symbol of a new triumphant alliance. No one spoke of Mittelwerk. No one mentioned the SS. The impact was electric. America was back in the game. But the political impact was even more profound. President Eisenhower recognized that this inter-service rivalry, Army versus Navy, was crippling. The space race was not a military squabble. It was the central technological and ideological battle of the 20th century. In July 1958, he signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. It created a new civilian agency that would consolidate all of America's non-military space efforts. It was called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. The very next year, in a move that solidified the pact made in 1945, the entire Army Ballistic Missile Agency, Wernher von Braun, his original paperclip team, their 1,200 American engineers, and their entire Redstone Arsenal facility were transferred, lock, stock, and barrel, to NASA. They were given a new home, the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, and they were given a new, seemingly impossible mission: put a man on the moon. The deal with the devil had been finalized. The men who had built V-2s to destroy London were now the men chosen by the United States to win the heavens. Their pasts were no longer just paperclipped. They were irrelevant, eclipsed by the bright, burning ambition of the Apollo program. Part 5. The Cathedral and the Moon. May 25, 1961, Washington, D.C. President John F. Kennedy, young, charismatic, and stung by the recent Soviet triumph of putting the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit, stood before a joint session of Congress. The Cold War was at its zenith. The Bay of Pigs fiasco had been a humiliation. America needed a victory so profound it would realign the world. "I believe," Kennedy declared, his voice ringing with a conviction that masked the sheer audacity of the proposal, "that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." In Huntsville, Alabama, Wernher von Braun watched the speech on television. He smiled. The politicians had finally caught up with his dreams. But the challenge was almost incomprehensible. This was not a small step beyond Explorer 1. It was a quantum leap. They didn't just need a bigger rocket. They needed a monster. They needed a machine that did not yet exist, built with technologies that had not been invented. The task of building this machine fell to von Braun and his team at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. The rocket would be called the Saturn V. The Saturn V was von Braun's cathedral. It was the physical manifestation of every equation he had ever scribbled, every V-2 that had flown, every redstone that had proven his theories. It would stand 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It would weigh 6.5 million pounds. Its first stage, powered by 5 gargantuan F-1 engines, would generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust, consuming 15 tons of fuel per second. It was and remains the most powerful machine ever successfully built by humanity. And the man von Braun put in charge of the entire Saturn V program, the project manager overseeing every bolt, every weld, and every system, was his most trusted colleague from the old days. It was Arthur Rudolph. the man whose file had been paperclipped, the man who had run the Mittelwerk factory, where 20,000 human beings were worked to death. He was now, without question, one of the most important men in the United States government, the chief architect of America's lunar ambition. This was the apex of Operation Paperclip. The moral compromise made in secret in 1945 was now the very engine of America's national destiny. For the next 8 years, Huntsville was a city possessed. The work was relentless. Von Braun ruled Marshall not as a boss, but as a high priest. He was brilliant, demanding, and visionary. He knew every detail, from the complex turbopumps of the engines to the alloys used in the fuel tanks. His German team, now in their 50s and 60s, formed the core of the leadership. Their meticulous academic approach to engineering fused with the dynamic, high-speed culture of America's best and brightest. They tested, they failed, they tested again. They solved thousands of problems, from catastrophic vibrations that could shake the rocket apart, a phenomenon called pogo oscillation, to the complexities of multi-stage separation at hypersonic speeds. July 16, 1969, Cape Canaveral, Florida. The world held its breath. 1 million people crowded the beaches and causeways around the Kennedy Space Center. The Saturn V, carrying the Apollo 11 crew, stood gleaming on Launch Pad 39A. In the Launch Control Center, the firing room was a sea of white shirts and black ties. At the launch director's console sat Kurt Debus, another original paperclip scientist from Peenemünde. The final countdown began. At 9:32 a.m., the F-1 engines ignited. For a heart-stopping second, the rocket was engulfed in a man-made volcano of fire and smoke. The sound was a physical, visceral roar that hammered the chest and rattled windows 100 miles away, was the sound of raw, controlled power. The rocket began to move, impossibly slow at first, as if lifting the weight of the world. Then it climbed. In the VIP viewing stands, Wernher von Braun watched, tears streaming down his face. This was it. This was the moment his entire life had been aimed at. The V2, Mittelwerk, the surrender, Fort Bliss, the Redstone, Sputnik, Explorer 1. It had all led to this perfect, terrifying, magnificent ascent. 4 days later, on July 20th, 1969, an estimated 650 million people around the world watched a grainy black-and-white television feed. They heard the voice of Neil Armstrong. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. America had won. The future had been secured. The pact, sealed with a simple paperclip 25 years earlier, had been fulfilled beyond all imagination. Wernher von Braun was no longer just an American hero. He was a global icon, the man who had given humanity the stars. The triumph was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed the past would be buried forever. The men of Operation Paperclip had reached a height where their shadows, cast all the way from the darkness of the Harz Mountains, could no longer be seen. But history has a long memory, and in the bright, unforgiving light of victory, the bill for the deal with the devil was about to come due. Part 6. The Reckoning, 1970 to 1984, Washington, D.C. and Huntsville, Alabama. The triumph of Apollo 11 was the high-water mark. Almost immediately, the political winds shifted. The Vietnam War was raging, social unrest was dividing the country, and the staggering cost of the space program became a target for budget cuts. Wernher von Braun, the man who had dreamed of Mars, was transferred to a desk job at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., tasked with strategic planning. He found himself in a city of politicians, not engineers. His proposals for a mission to Mars were seen as fantastically expensive and politically unnecessary. The public's romance with space had faded. Disillusioned, von Braun retired from NASA in 1972. The man who had commanded an army of 20,000 engineers and scientists at Marshall, the man who had built the Saturn V, spent his last few years working for an aerospace company. He died of cancer in 1977. His past, the SS uniform, the Mittelwerk horrors, was barely mentioned in his obituaries. He was eulogized simply as the man who gave America the moon. It seemed the secret would die with him, but it wouldn't. In 1979, the U.S. Department of Justice, under pressure from Congress and Holocaust survivor groups, established a new unit, the Office of Special Investigations, OSI. Its sole purpose was to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals who had lied on their immigration forms and were living, protected, in the United States. At first, the OSI focused on low-level figures, concentration camp guards, collaborationist police officers. But their investigations inevitably led them to a set of files that had been sealed for over 30 years, files stamped with a simple paperclip. The investigators, led by a hard-charging lawyer named Eli Rosenbaum, were stunned. They were not just finding guards, they were finding the pillars of the American establishment. And one name topped their list: Arthur Rudolph. The man who managed the Saturn V program, the man who had been awarded NASA's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal. The OSI began to rebuild the history that Operation Paperclip had so carefully erased. They dug up the original Mittelwerk files. They found records of Rudolph's brutal efficiency, his requests for more slave laborers from the Dora Mittelbau camp, his presence at hangings. They built an ironclad case. In 1982, they confronted him. Arthur Rudolph was living a quiet, comfortable retirement in San Jose, California. He was a revered figure, a founding father of the space age. And now 2 men from the Justice Department were sitting in his living room laying out evidence of mass murder. Rudolph was trapped. The deal made in 1945 had a fatal flaw. His citizenship was based on a lie. His paper-clipped file, which stated he was not an ardent Nazi, was a fraud. The U.S. government was in a terrible position. If they put Arthur Rudolph on trial, all the secrets of Operation Paperclip would be exposed. It would mean admitting that NASA, America's most beloved agency, was co-founded by a man directly responsible for atrocities. It would tarnish the glory of the moon landing itself. So they offered him a new deal, a quiet one. Rudolph was given a choice. He could fight the charges in a public trial, risking a conviction, deportation, and the loss of his pension, or he could voluntarily surrender his American citizenship, the citizenship he had sworn an oath to 30 years earlier, and leave the country forever. In exchange, the U.S. government would not prosecute, and his NASA pension would remain intact. On November 28, 1983, Arthur Rudolph signed the agreement. In March 1984, the man who built the rocket that took America to the moon walked into the U.S. consulate in Hamburg, West Germany, and handed over his blue American passport. He would never set foot in the United States again. The story broke, and it was a quiet bombshell. The heroes of Huntsville were suddenly re-examined. Other investigations began. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, the celebrated father of space medicine, whose work on life support systems was critical for the Apollo missions, was found to have been the director of an aviation medical research institute in Berlin that conducted horrific experiments on prisoners from Dachau, including freezing them and placing them in low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude conditions. He died in 1986, just before the OSI could formally bring a case against him. The reckoning had come. The men of Operation Paperclip, who had been lifted to the status of legends, were finally being forced to confront their pasts.
Epilogue: The Price of the Future. Operation Paperclip was never a secret of if, but a secret of how. It was the story of a nation so focused on the future that it willingly and systematically buried the past. Was it worth it? It is the most uncomfortable of questions. The 1,600 German and Austrian mines brought to America under Paperclip and its related programs were directly responsible for America's missile arsenal, its dominance in the Cold War, its intelligence-gathering satellites, and most famously, its journey to the moon. They built the modern world. They were also, in many cases, unrepentant agents of a regime that represented the very evil America had fought a world war to destroy. They built their knowledge on a foundation of slave labor, suffering, and death. The operation highlights a chilling, pragmatic truth. Knowledge is power, and it is amoral. It does not care who wields it. The equations that can send a V-2 rocket crashing into a London suburb are the same equations that can launch a Saturn V rocket to the stars. The story of Operation Paperclip is the ultimate American parable. It is the story of the young, pragmatic, and ambitious nation that, in its race to defeat one enemy, was willing to make a deal with another. It is the story of a pact with the devil, where the bill was deferred for 40 years. The United States won the moon. It won the Cold War. And it did so by paperclipping over the darkest parts of human history, proving that even the brightest leap for mankind can begin with a step from the darkest of places.